I'm Steve Tolle, Chief Product and Technology Officer at IgniteData, and I'm joined today by Jose.
Hi, I'm Jose Galvez. I'm the Chief Medical Information Officer at IgniteData.
And we're going to talk today about structured data and how our strategy is evolving at IgniteData. So let me set the table. We launched the Archer product about a year ago now, and we started with a focus in the area of oncology clinical trials and focused on early stage study support with some of our flagship site customers here in the United States and in the UK. We started looking at where do research coordinators spend the most amount of time on an ongoing basis supporting a study, and what kind of data do they need to move on a regular basis? And then we went and looked at the FHIR support for that kind of data, and we made the decision to focus on vitals and labs to start, because we knew from the start of a study to the end of a study, there would be a lot of vitals data, a lot of lab data moved. We also started to look at things like medications and what kind of support we needed for things like medications and concomitant medication tracking. So when we launched Archer, we really launched with 2.5 data types because we could support medications, but we very quickly found out that medications were a little complicated. And so we decided to go to market with labs and vitals, and then we would add additional structured data later on. We're now at a point where we're supporting multiple studies at multiple sites across the world, which is great. We're also supporting different therapeutic areas, including cardiology. And we're looking at what other data types can we support using the US Common Core FHIR protocol. So I wanted to talk with Jose today about where do we go, how do we pick what we add, and why it's important. And so it's important to note that we have added some additional support for different types of data. So we've just added the ability to pull in past medical history based on what's in the problem list in the electronic health record. We've added the ability to support adverse events, and actually one of our sites is going live today, ironically, to support adverse events for their internal investigator-led trial. And we're hoping to add commercial sponsor adverse events sometime in the next couple of months. But beyond that, we're really focusing on how do we get the whole US CDI FHIR data set supported and why that matters. So Jose, it might be helpful for you to give a little bit of background of where you've spent before you came to Ignite, and then talk a little bit about why it's so important for our sponsors and our sites to continue to add these kinds of data domains.
Sure. So a little bit about myself. As already mentioned, I'm the Chief Medical Officer here. Before this, I was a Deputy Director with CDER, FDA at CDER. And then prior to that, I was with NCI at the NIH and also at the Clinical Center, where I ran one of their large research databases at the Clinical Center at NIH. I've focused a great deal of my career on looking at standards, looking at FHIR, and really the regulatory landscape. How do we take advantage of these standards to simplify and standardize the data that comes across from both our sponsors and then ultimately into our regulators, that allow them to look at the standardized data and make those types of regulatory decisions, about safety and efficacy for the products that we all take every day. So if we're looking at the importance of the USCDI, we have to remember that where USCDI started. So USCDI really is that baseline of FHIR data that's required by all of the current EHRs in the United States. So we have a baseline of interoperable data that can be shared between a variety of entities. And with clinical trials, this is critical because there's a great deal of data that's in there, which, for example, in our cardiology trials, how do we measure something as simple as a heart rate or as an EKG or any of those types of simple measurements that when you're in your clinician's office seems simple, but when they get translated into the EHR and then ultimately into a clinical trial, the standards around that become very important. What is it that we exactly mean by a systolic and diastolic? What are the ranges? And when is it out of range? Oftentimes the numbers aren't as important as whether something is within range or out of range. And that's where the USCDI will help us standardize these things and give us that baseline set of data that our clinical researchers can build on for the additional therapeutic areas.
And as you think about, different stages of trials, when we went live first, we were focused on how do we focus on safety, toxicity, right? So that made sense for labs and vitals. But as we go down or up the value chain, focusing on later stage studies with our sponsors, how do you think about things like tumor tracking and resist and other information that might not necessarily live as source in the electronic health record, but might live somewhere else? How important is that going to be for us?
So I think as clinical trials move forward, through the different stages, it's going to be critical that we're able to get these data elements in a reliable, consistent fashion for our sponsors. Things like tumor size, resist measurements that we're pulling out of the radiology information management systems are going to be critical that we get them right. So these systems are very good now at being able to measure tumor size and create the resist measurements to track the tumor measurement. But as you mentioned, they often don't make it into the EHR in a standardized way. So our ability to go to the source systems and pull that data directly and maintain that chain of custody. So when these things ultimately end up at a regulator's desk, we have clear indication where we're getting the data from the source through Archer. It's been unchanged directly to that regulatory officer, so they know that the decisions that they're making on whether a particular drug does in fact affect tumor size, does in fact have a positive effect on patient lives, that they can make those decisions reliably.
I guess one thing we should talk about is workflow, because we know that sites do things differently. So, for example, we know that some sites are starting to use Epic's adverse event module, other sites aren't yet. We know that some sites document concomitant medications in a note because, an EMR can have a lot of medication data.
Mm-hmm.
But others actually may use the medication module of the electronic health record to track that. So as we think about workflow differences and we think about this hybrid approach that Archer supports, where we can automate the movement of some data, but you could always have the option to go supplement, documenting the data directly in the electronic data capture system. What do you think the right balance is for a site? So they might be keeping track of concomitant meds in a note, but do they really want to re-enter all that medication data, or should they try to move it as well with Archer? So can you just talk a little bit about workflow and how we have to be mindful of how clinicians work every day?
That's a really good point. The biggest problem, or one of the main issues that clinicians face when they're seeing patients, the reality is clinicians have about 15 minutes with their patients. In those 15 minutes, they need to assess where the patient is right now, what the issues are for them, what the next treatment round is going to be, and how best to treat them, and then do the documentation and move on to the next patient. So for the clinician, it's very little time, lots of context switching. So it's critical that tools like Archer don't get in their way. If we have a negative impact on their workflow, it's going to impact patient care, and they're ultimately not going to use, and they're just going to scribble notes and transcribe it into the HR later on and have someone else have to do this. So the critical point is to make sure that we are providing value, that we're simplifying that workflow, and that we're providing an avenue for data to flow seamlessly. Now, they bring up the good example with medications. Whether the clinician or the nurse practitioner or the clinical trialist puts the data in a clinical note or uses the Epic module has more to do with what is going to make their life easier than our life. So what we want to do is work with the sponsors to help them standardize their ECRFs. So we are minimizing the variability, maximizing the tools that are the EHRs bring, and allowing us to interact with the EHR in a way that doesn't impact the workflow and in fact would help them in their workflow. So if we bring an advantage to them to use that module, to put the drug in there rather than putting it in a note and then having to transcribe it later, then we've simplified their workflow and given them a reason to use it. Without a reason, they're going to fall back on what's simple, what's easy, and oftentimes that's just going to be a medical note.
So we're talking a lot about structured data, and US CDI is very rich. It has things like smoking status and SDOH and, order information. Even if labs are done centrally, we still would have like the lab order. There's a lot to add beyond the 5 or 6 domains that we support now. How do you think about setting priorities for that? We're going to try to do a lot of this data domain expansion over the next couple of releases, so the next 6 months. But we're not going to do it all at once. So when you think about relative value to a site and to a sponsor, and you think things like demographics, right?
Mm-hmm.
They enter demographics once.
Right.
So is that a high priority, or should we instead first focus on things like, previous procedures or things that they just have to track routinely? And I just love to get your thoughts on when you talk to sponsors and sites, because I know that's what you're doing right now. How do we talk about relative priority setting?
So unfortunately, relative priority is going to vary across our sites and our sponsors, what's important to them at that particular moment, and really how that works into their workflow. When I think of things like demographics, true, for a given clinical trial, they're only entering it once. But let's take a look at the broader picture. As we start looking at how do we bring more clinical trials to patients, how do we facilitate that? We're looking at how do we get at the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So if we ask a site to enroll a lot of their participants in a trial that's really designed to look at inclusion-exclusion criteria to help facilitate which patients fit a particular clinical trial, then we're looking at the demographics become very important because that's part of what that inclusion-exclusion criteria is going to help whittle down. So for those types of trials, for lack of a better way to describe it, it's going to be important that we do that. That's still probably going to take a lower priority than getting something like procedures and medications and history, because that is going to happen at every single clinical trial. They're going to want to know what that is, and being able to get that data out of the EHR into the EDC is going to be much more beneficial to them, because that's still a lot of transcribing that they have to do right now and hunting for the right data element. So the more that we can help with that workflow, the easier it's going to be. The more we can help them when we're looking at procedures, narrowing down that procedure list to the one that they're looking for. Are they looking for surgical procedures? Are they looking for, which type of procedure are they looking for? That's going to be much more beneficial to them than just seeing that huge laundry list and having to comb through the medical record.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We talk a lot about structured data, but the reality is there's still a ton of valuable data that's not structured. It's in a note, it's in a lab report or a radiology report. How do we, and I know we've got obviously a strategy to tackle that, but when we think about unstructured data and the use of things like generative AI and an agentic approach to this, how do you think about managing the quality of that clinically? Because, I think that's going to be one of the models themselves. There are 14 or 1,500 different models out there that we can play with and test and develop. But we have to make sure that we have the right level of accuracy, the right level of data provenance. So how do you think about that as our CMO, and how do you think we're going to navigate that big issue?
Well, I think this is a really exciting time to be looking at that. If you had asked me this question even a year ago, I would say that large language models are nowhere near capable of being able to do this, and I wouldn't have anticipated that we'd be even thinking about it right now. But I think the models have gotten a lot better about being able to pull out that data. The beauty of medicine, if we're looking at a specific therapeutic area, and I think we may have to tackle it therapeutic area by therapeutic area, at least initially, is that we can narrow down that language that we're needing to pull out. We can narrow down the disease sets and the terminology that's typically used by the researchers in that focus group. And so I think it's going to be important that we start off with the types of ontologies and vocabularies that are typically used for a therapeutic area, and match them against what's being pulled out by the large language models to make sure that we get the language correct. Like anything, medicine and research is even more notorious. It is a foreign language, and often words have multiple meanings, and it's going to be critical that we get it right for the specific therapeutic area. The same words can have different meanings depending on the therapeutic area, and for that matter, even the medical specialty. So pairing it up with the right ontologies is going to be important.
That's really helpful. You know, I remember when you first joined, I think we were doing your press release, and you said something about the gift that clinical trial participants give us. And, you know, at IgniteData, we have our founders and a lot of our executives have been affected personally by cancer. I think it's always important to go back to why do we do this? You know, what's our goal? It's not just about making the workflow easy. I think it would be important to hear from you in terms of, from a mission perspective, what are we trying to do at the end of the day?
That is so critical. It's the mission that drives, I think, everything that we do. If all we were really concerned with was decreasing the administrative burden, I don't think we'd be able to have a major impact. It is true. I truly believe that our patients give us a gift. Every time they volunteer for clinical studies, they're putting themselves in harm's way, and the data that they give us is a gift. Sometimes it's very easy for them to give. It's a blood draw, it's a lab. It's relatively painless. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a very invasive procedure. Sometimes it has no benefit for them immediately, but it helps drive the science forward. And they know that, and that's why they're participating. And I think we would be remiss not to use every bit of that data over and over to the extent possible to help move science forward so we can find these cures. That's absolutely critical, and it's what drives me every single day. As a pathologist, having run labs, looking at the glass, rendering the diagnosis, telling a patient they have cancer, or telling a patient they no longer have cancer, which is even better. But it's that flow of information, making sure that it is correct from patient down to the person at the lab bench, helping them make those data-driven decisions that's going to help us move forward and ultimately help reduce the burden of cancer or any of the other diseases that really plague us today. So this is very critical. We have one opportunity to get it right, and losing focus of why we're doing this is, in my mind, not acceptable, and this is what drives us every single day.
I appreciate that. Well, look, I want to thank you, Jose, for your time and your thoughts. We're very excited to be working with our sponsors and our co-development sites to get this data domain expansion accelerated. And then, of course, to start focusing on the unstructured data that we can start harvesting as well. But we'll continue to have these conversations and to move the agenda forward. And we're thrilled to have you on this team and helping guide us here. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity. Great talking to you today.